there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's the early hours of May 1, 2010, and Shannan Gilbert calls 911 from a house in Long Island, New York. She's there working as an escort with a client she met on Craigslist. "There's somebody after me," she repeatedly tells the operator.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you, ma'am?
I don't know.
The entire call lasts 22 minutes. She sounds calm and then confused. You can hear her talking to two men in the background. She keeps telling someone to stop, please. Then she starts running down the street. You can hear her screaming and breathing heavily. She asks neighbours for help, knocking on their doors. 2 different homes call police. But when they finally dispatch officers to the area, Shannan is nowhere to be found. Months pass, and despite extensive searches by local law enforcement, there is no sign of the 23-year-old. They do, however, stumble on another grisly discovery. The bodies of 4 young women. All of them, like Shannan, are escorts who met their clients online. The similarities between the women are uncanny. All of them petite, all of them in their 20s, all of them working as sex workers, posting ads on Craigslist. Immediately, police know they're hunting a serial killer. The following year, 6 more sets of remains are found in the same area, bringing the body count to 10. The hunt for answers intensifies. This is a case with many twists and turns, all culminating in a sensational arrest in July 2023, more than a decade after the bodies were found. Rex Heurmann has been charged with multiple counts of murder and is currently awaiting trial. It was supposed to start in September this year, but has been delayed. Alexis Linkletter is a true crime producer and investigative journalist from Long Island who has been reporting at length on the case and continues to provide updates via her podcast, Unravelled. Alexis joins us now. Shannan Gilbert, during her 911 call, 2 men could be heard in the background while she was telling the operator she was unsafe and someone was after her. What do we now know about what was happening on that May 1st morning?
Right. So on that May 1st morning, we know that Shannan Gilbert was called to the home of Joseph Brewer, and she was brought there by her driver, Michael Pack. And at that point, when Shannan had called 911, Joseph Brewer was trying to get her out of his house because she was panicking about something. And you can hear them on the 911 call in the background sort of seeming to talk to each other. It's kind of unintelligible, but it sounds like they're communicating about what to do.
Her disappearance prompted a search of the nearby area. What did that search uncover? And it was something that went on for several months.
Yeah, so at first, the search for her uncovered nothing. It wasn't until December of that year that a police officer conducting a search with a search dog found some skeletal remains. And everyone assumed that those remains would be that of the missing Shannan Gilbert, the woman they had been looking for. But that wasn't the case. It turns out these remains actually belonged to a missing young woman named Melissa Bartholomew. And after those remains were found, the remains of 3 other women were also found, left there nearly identically, and they were left about 500 feet from each other along the stretch of highway that was in very close proximity to the neighborhood where Shannan Gilbert vanished from.
Can you tell us a little bit about the women? Let's start with Melissa, because her family in particular had been receiving kind of taunting phone calls, hadn't they?
Yes. So shortly after Melissa's disappearance, her sister, Amanda, received calls from an unknown person. This person used a lot of derogatory language. This person had explicitly said things like, I'm watching your sister rot, your sister is dead, just things like that. The exact verbiage, we don't know, but that was the types of things this person was saying. And at that point, Melissa had been missing. So these were obviously very terrifying calls to receive.
Who was Melissa and the other women, Amber, Megan and Maureen? They all had a lot of similarities, didn't they?
Yes. So they were all young women. They were all petite and they were all advertising their services on Craigslist because they were working as sex workers. But that's not what any of them wanted to be doing. Melissa Bartholomew was last seen in New York City. She had goals of opening her own hair salon. She had a lot of friends, a lot of people who loved her. Megan Waterman was from Maine, and she was essentially trafficked across state lines by her boyfriend/pimp to conduct sex work on Long Island and in the city. And that's what she was doing when she was last seen. And then Amberlynn Costello, she was actually the only one living on Long Island when she disappeared. And she was last seen getting into a truck in front of her house, presumably with a client, and then she was never seen again. And then Maureen Brainerd Barnes, same thing. She was a young sex worker who vanished after meeting a client.
What kind of time frame are we talking about when these women went missing?
So Maureen Brainerd Barnes vanished in 2007, and the others disappeared between that and 2009, with the final two disappearing within just a few months of each other in 2009.
And when police found their bodies, were they able to determine anything about how they died?
Presumably, yes, but that information wasn't released right away. And because it was skeletal remains, very little was released to the public at that time. What the public was made aware of is that these women were petite, they were wrapped in burlap, and that's kind of all we learned, and that's all we knew for a really long time.
A discovery like this is obviously shocking. Did police immediately know that they were hunting a serial killer? Because I can imagine that starts some pretty serious task forces and escalations, that kind of thing.
So at first, when the Gilgo Four, and that's what those first victims were referred to as, the Gilgo Four, the assumption right away was that somebody had killed these four victims. Where there was a diversion in terms of the theories, that occurred in April of the following year, which is when several more sets of human remains were found along Ocean Parkway. But these victims, the circumstances were much different. There were victims that were dismembered. There were victims that varied in terms of the race of the victim. The victimology differed. And we had a victim who was biologically male, dressed in women's clothing, who was killed as a result of blunt force trauma. So the MO started to become very varied. And that's when the big debate about whether we were dealing with one or two killers really arose.
Because that was 6 more people, wasn't it? There was even a toddler among those remains.
Yes. So that's when the controversy really began about whether one person was responsible for all of these people. But as far as the first 4, everyone believed right away that one person had done all of those.
And then Shannan's remains were eventually found as well.
Yes, 18 months after she disappeared, Shannan was found. And interestingly, her remains were found very close to where she disappeared from, which created a lot of questions about how thorough the search had been for her to begin with. How had they not discovered her sooner if she was essentially right down the street from where she vanished from?
And interestingly, with Shannan, police actually said that they didn't think she'd been murdered.
Right. That also creates a lot of confusion for people, especially given her similarities to these other victims that were found right down the street. It's hard to believe for a lot of people that she's not a murder victim. But the Suffolk County Police Department essentially says, and they stand by the fact that they believe Shannan Gilbert died as a result of misadventure, which is essentially sort of an unknown cause. They believe she succumbed to the elements, whether that's suffering some sort of psychotic drug-induced episode that caused her to crawl into this really thick brush and drowned. They've been sort of unclear because, again, 18 months later, she was found in a state of just skeletal remains. It's hard to know what exactly caused her death.
So this is 10 bodies, 11 including Shannan. For those who haven't been to Long Island, I haven't. Is it quite a small area geographically to be finding all of these remains?
So Long Island itself, to give context, is 30 miles wide by 100 miles long. This particular area, if you look at a map, it's a long stretch of land, but when you're there, it feels extremely small. It's really remote. There are no other houses there. And the strip of land between the road, it's on the water. So it's on a highway. The strip of land between where the road is and the water is very small. So it's just a very specific place. It doesn't seem like a very obvious place for someone to hide human remains. So the idea that there was this massive concentration of victims in this one area led a lot of people to suspect that, yes, we're dealing with one serial killer. But again, because the victims that were found later varied so much and differed so much from the first four, there was still a big question mark over whether or not there's one killer or multiple killers, especially because of victims like the toddler, where it's such a departure from what we're dealing with as far as young women in their 20s who are active in sex work. It really caused a lot of confusion.
I want to ask you personally how it felt to have this news breaking, because you're from Long Island, aren't you?
Yeah, so I grew up going to the beaches where this all occurred. It's devastating because most of Long Island, it's very affluent in most parts. You think of it as a very safe place. It's a place where people from the city have, expensive summer homes. You would just never think that something so insidious could be happening and be happening for so long without people realizing it.
I want to focus on the Gilgo Four, as they were known. Were there any witnesses or people in the women's orbits that were able to give police any decent clues in those early days?
It turns out, yes, although that's not something we learned about until July of 2023.
Yeah, wow.
But it turns out that Amber Lynn Costello, who was the last victim to disappear in the summer of 2009, we found out a little bit about her last 2 days before she vanished. And what occurred is that she was advertising her sex work services on Craigslist, and she was engaging with a client through text. And her roommates decided that they wanted money, but she didn't want to have sex with this client. So they were going to do sort of a ruse and basically have the client come over, and then Amber's roommate would interrupt and act like her angry boyfriend. Then the client would be chased off. He would have already given the money, and she wouldn't have had to go through with this act. So this happens, and the roommate actually does get into a physical altercation with this client, who he describes as someone, who's 6'5", hulking. He describes him as looking like an ogre. And another key detail he includes is that this man was driving a green Chevy Avalanche, an early 2002 model. So we've learned that the next day after this ruse occurred with this client, the client reached back out to Amber and said something to the effect of, "That wasn't nice. Do I get credit for next time?" Suggesting that he'd still like to see her and make another appointment. And based on Amber's cell phone records, we've now learned that she did agree to meet this client on the very day that she disappeared. And neighbors later said they saw Amber walking in the direction of a green Chevy Avalanche. So putting the pieces together, she's meeting up with this man who was disgruntled the day before, and that's the last time she's ever seen. And this tip about the avalanche was provided. So it's strange that this is the clue that would eventually lead the Suffolk County Police Department to a suspect, because they had this clue all along. So why wasn't it followed up on then? We'll never really know.
Were there any suspects in those early days that the public knew about or that the police kind of shared details about?
So as far as official suspects, the police were not transparent about that. But something that really put a spotlight on this case was the fact that a lot of people suspected that the Suffolk County Chief of Police had a hand in the Long Island serial killer case. So from a pop culture standpoint, as far as people who are familiar with this case, the police chief, his name is James Burke, is someone who comes up right away, someone who is front and center. And he has been accused of not only being the Long Island serial killer, but also just that he purposefully derailed and sabotaged the case, which is why it remained unsolved for 13 years.
Well, that in particular, James Burke, the investigation stalling, is what you started to investigate and kind of dig a bit deeper into because you did have a personal connection there. Can you tell us about Chris and what he told you, what happened to him?
Sure. So I went to high school with a guy named Christopher Loeb. I call him Chris. And I was working in the true crime space in Los Angeles. I had moved away from Long Island. And around, 2013, I started hearing that he was in jail for something he had done involving the Suffolk County Police Chief. Now, we were put in touch after many years of not being in contact, and that's when he told me the story of what happened. So what occurred was, by this point, Chris had become a heroin addict. Opioid addiction is something that a lot of people on Long Island struggle with, and all over the United States. That's a big problem. So in the throes of addiction, in order to fuel his habit, he's resorted to robbing cars to find things to steal. And he was doing just that in December of 2012. And it was then that he came upon a black SUV, and the doors were unlocked, and he opened the door and he stole a duffel bag out of this car. He doesn't look at it until he gets home. And when he opens the bag, he finds some peculiar things. He finds magazines, for ammunition. He finds evidence bags, things that you might find in a police officer's duffel bag. But he also finds things like anal beads, porn, sex toys, really bizarre items to also be with these police items. And this bag belonged to the Suffolk County Police Department's Chief of Police, James Burke. So after the theft of this bag, Chris was on probation for a different crime. And I don't know how, no one really knows how, Burke knew it was Chris. But James Burke, the chief of police, and several other officers descended upon Chris's house and entered the home under the guise of it being, a routine sort of probationary search. And they recover the bag and they beat up Chris in front of his mother and they drag him down to the police station. And after that, he's subsequently, beaten and tortured and taunted by James Burke. And after that, James Burke threatens everybody who was there to never say a word. And there was basically a conspiracy to cover up what's just happened that ensues after that. Chris is thrown in jail and silenced as a result. And it's at that point that he and I reconnect and I realize, whoa, there's really a story here. But I entered this story thinking that this was a story about political corruption. It wasn't until I started piecing together the timeline of everything that I realized how much influence James Burke would have had over the Long Island serial killer case.
Well, there was one particular detail that Chris gave you about a DVD that quite clearly could incriminate him in terms of the Long Island killer. Can you tell us about that?
So Chris alleges that, and this is something he didn't tell anyone until he participated in my series Unraveled. And this was a story he told in 2020 when this event occurred in 2012. But he said that there was a snuff film DVD in the bag. And he said that the girl on the film looked like Megan Waterman, one of the Gilgo Four victims. Now, I don't believe that, but when you're doing journalism, when you're a journalist, you can't really insert your opinion. I was skeptical, but it is what Chris swore up and down happened. And was it just a blonde girl who looked like Megan? Maybe. Was it a fake snuff film where it's porn that's really rough and that's what's supposed to be depicted? There was a lot of nuance with what it could have been at that time, but everybody heard this. And immediately, the conspiracy theorists were abound with theories about James Burke being the Long Island serial killer. And we uncovered so many truthful things from his past about what he did with sex workers. He had a really checkered history. He was violent with many sex workers. He was known to hire sex workers. He had a long-term relationship with a sex worker. And in fact, he attended a sex party in Oak Beach, which is the same neighborhood where Shannan Gilbert disappeared from, and was engaged with a sex worker, was violent with her. It just looked really bad as far as, yeah, of course you wouldn't want the FBI or any other larger police agencies investigating this case and potentially uncovering your ties to these women and to this neighborhood where the women were found.
So, allegations of snuff film aside, there was plenty of solid evidence you were able to find about James. And in fact, he actually stood down, didn't he? There was proof that he kind of fumbled the investigation.
Yeah, so it's on record that the FBI tried to get involved and he blocked that. He was ultimately charged for what he did to Chris Loeb, and he didn't do it alone. He had accomplices, and he was working with the district attorney, which is, I don't know what they call them in Australia, but it's just the highest prosecuting attorney for the state, essentially, for this county. And it turns out his name's Tom Spoda. He's in jail right now for his involvement in this. And him and James Burke had a relationship for 40 years where they were essentially involved in corruption together, helping each other. It was kind of a quid pro quo relationship where they were covering up a lot of stuff. So yeah, it really got serious when they were indicted for their roles in this. And people really started to suspect, okay, whether James Burke is a serial killer or not, he has a hand in why this case is not solved.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with true crime host and producer Alexis Linkletter. Up next, I ask Alexis how the police managed to discover and catch who they suspected to be the Long Island serial killer. Well, let's skip forward to 2022 because a new task force was formed, and within 6 weeks they had a new potential suspect. How did police find Rex Heurmann?
So we were all very excited when the new task force was assembled, and there was this renewed effort to really regroup and do this right from the start. And it's a little disheartening to realize that it only took them 6 weeks of true focus, of real valiant effort to do this, considering how many people had been suffering for how long without these answers. But essentially, it was the tip provided by Amberlynn Costello's roommate about the Chevy avalanche that actually led the police to the door of their suspect. And that's frustrating because that means it wasn't like they found a new piece of evidence or a new tip or anything. It was a tip they had that had been ignored, that had been slipped through the cracks, that was lost in a time when James Burke would have kind of been in control of how to solve this case. So it sort of proved our hypothesis about why this case wasn't solved, because they had this information all along. And it was ironic that it was a female investigator who uncovered it, which I loved.
Well, as you say, 2 decades it sat there in front of them. There was also some DNA that they were able to link, wasn't there?
Yes. So we didn't know this until there was an arrest, but several hairs had been found on the remains of the Gilgo Four. And Megan Waterman, that victim, there was a male hair that was found. And once Rex Heurmann, who is the suspect who would come to be arrested, once he was identified as the person who owned that Chevy Avalanche, they were able to follow him and get a surreptitious DNA sample and connect it to hairs that they recovered on this victim, Megan Waterman. They were also able to connect Rex Heurmann's family to other hairs found on other victims. So that was a huge development because the Chevy Avalanche is a great connection, but it's not what juries want to see these days. They really want to see DNA. So to be able to link him with DNA was huge.
So they arrested him in July 2023, initially only charging him with 3 of the murders. Eventually he was charged with a 4th. Can you tell us about that 4th charge? Because the allegations in that case were quite surprising, weren't they?
So with the 4th one, with the timeline we discussed between 2007 and 2009, with the Gilgo Four victims,
yes,
they were able to charge him with the 3 that occurred later across those couple of years. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was the first victim who disappeared in 2007. So presumably they just had less in the form of, digital evidence. With the other 3 victims, they had phone records and they had text messages. They were able to conclude that Rex Heurmann's family was out of town when each of these occurred. But it just took a little longer to charge him with Maureen Brainerd Barnes' murder. But it was revealed that instead of waiting for all 4, which is, I think, what they wanted to do initially, there was a sense of urgency to get these charges filed because they suspected that he might kill again because his family had a trip coming up. And that was something that they had been able to identify as a constant for when each of these victims disappeared. So they also were tracking his phones and seeing that he was talking to sex workers. They were just very worried that he was ramping up. So that's why they pulled the trigger, even though they only had enough for the 3 at the time.
I know police don't think that Shannan was murdered, but it's really hard to separate her from the Gilgo Four, considering she was also in sex work. She also found people on Craigslist. Do they allege she had any run-in with Heurmann?
They have not disclosed whether or not they have found a link between Shannan Gilbert and Rex Heurmann. However, people have come forward claiming that there is a link between Shannan Gilbert and Rex Heurmann, but law enforcement have not verified this information. But John Ray has taken affidavits from witnesses who claim to have seen Rex Heurmann with Shannan Gilbert at a motel in Suffolk County. So there are claims that there may be a connection there. I think what is a challenge with Shannan Gilbert would be connecting him to that Oak Beach neighborhood, which, as far as I've heard, there are no connections. There are no connections between Joseph Brewer and Michael Pack, the men who were heard in the background of that 911 call. It's hard to know how, okay, there's all this proof that Shannan ran from that house that night. She knocked on neighbors' doors. Rex Heurmann would have had to encounter her by happenstance while she's screaming, running through a road in the middle of the night. And he has no ties to this area. So it's just hard to understand how that would have happened.
So it's just a coincidence, which is wild.
Maybe, or maybe not. I think the fact that we're dealing with such a small area, like we discussed in the beginning, and the idea that so many men are connected to these sex workers in this way also reflects just a greater attitude about women, showing how pervasive this is, which it's not something I understood before getting involved in this case. It's one of the more bizarre elements of this case. It's really hard to understand how she could not be connected. It's really hard. It's hard to face that. You look at it on a map. This happened very close together. She also matches the descriptions of these women. She's petite, she's blonde, she fits, but then she doesn't. It's just very hard to understand.
What do we know about Heurmann? Married, kids, what does he do for work?
So we know that Rex Heurmann is married. He's been married twice. He's got a biological daughter and a son who he essentially adopted through marrying his second wife. He is a Long Island lifer, is what they call them, born and raised on Long Island. He currently, up until the moment of his arrest, lived in the home that he was raised in. He bought the house from his mother in the 90s, 91. And he is an architect. And in 93, I believe, is when he opened his own architectural firm. That office was located in Midtown Manhattan. And for geographical context, that's about an hour and change away from where he lives. And he lives in a town called Massapequa Park. And he commutes back and forth from his house to the city every day to get to his office. He has hobbies. He likes to hunt. He was a member of social groups. He's strange. We talked to people who went to high school with him. He was bullied. He was described as odd. He doesn't appear like, on paper, you wouldn't think he's a serial killer, but he looks like one.
Well, physically, he kind of fits that description the roommate gave, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, it's a perfect match. But what I just think is interesting about him, think about the most famous serial killers. Like, think about Brian Koberger. I don't know if you're familiar with that case, the Idaho college students. He doesn't look like a serial killer. Like, he's conventionally attractive. You know, Ted Bundy. It's like Rex Heurmann looks like a serial killer to me. Like,
he's
he
very
looks like
tall,
a monster.
He's quite intimidating.
He's huge. He's pasty. He's disheveled. And he has these vacant eyes. He's quite scary looking. But yeah, so that is sort of the summary about Rex Heurmann. You know, we also know that in college, he worked at these beaches doing maintenance and things like that near where these victims' remains were found. So he has very strong ties to this area. We know that Massapequa Park, where he lives, one of those phone calls to the sister of Melissa Bartholomew was able to be traced to Massapequa. So they knew they were looking for someone with ties to that area. Other calls were traced to Manhattan. They knew they were looking for someone with ties to that area as well. And he really fits the bill. And he had that same exact Chevy Avalanche, but he gave it to his brother. But he got a new one that's exactly like his old one. So this is a car he seems to really like. That's what we know about Rex Heurmann. He seems to have very strong emotional ties to this house. And it's interesting that he's an architect because his house is dilapidated. Like, it looks like it's on the verge of collapsing. He's got his porch propped up with a piece of plywood. It's really just in awful shape. And pictures of the inside reveal that there was some hoarding going on. It's really a bizarre situation, all of it.
Well, the house in particular is also a big focus of the investigation itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And we keep learning more and more about why that is. And while it's not been explicitly stated, evidence shows, and there are implications that suggest he used the basement of his house to commit these crimes. This is where they suspect the murders occurred over the course of days when his family was out of town. And with the evidence that has been made available, we're also piecing together these timelines. He was keeping his victims in his basement and still going to work, still going to meetings, keeping up a very normal facade of day-to-day life, even though he had victims in his basement, probably still alive, because we're learning that this was a prolonged experience for him. This wasn't something that he did quickly. This was something he did over days. And he was going to work, pretending to be normal and able to do that. The compartmentalization that takes is uncanny, but he was able to do this. And it's just a very scary, sobering realization that that's what we're dealing with.
Since his arrest, he has been charged with 2 other murders, Sandra Costilla and Jessica Taylor. What do we know about them and what happened to them?
So this is where it gets very interesting. So Sandra Costilla was murdered in 1993. And the MO in her case is completely different than with any of the others. She was stabbed. She was posed. She was left in a completely different area in Southampton, which is further east than where all of the other victims were found. And what's interesting about Sandra is that everybody suspected that Sandra was murdered by somebody else. So a man named John Bitroff was arrested in 2014 for the murders of 2 women, Rita Tangretti and Colleen McNamee. They were murdered within a 3-month period, and the woman murdered between them was Sandra Costilla in that timeline. And these 3 scenes had a lot of similarities. Everyone suspected that John Bitroff had killed Sandra Costilla also, but everyone just believed that the DA didn't have enough to charge him with Sandra's. But everyone knew, like, Sandra Costilla was killed by John Bitroff. So when they announced Rex Heurmann's indictment for Sandra's case, it was a huge surprise. Not only because everyone thought someone else did it, but this expands the timeline significantly because everyone to that point believed that with the 2000 murder of Valerie Mack would have been the first sort of in this serial killer series. He's not been charged for the murder of Valerie Mack to this point, but he has been named as a lead suspect officially by law enforcement. So the idea that now the timeline of when we know he was allegedly killing has expanded by 8 years is really alarming because it means there could be that many more victims.
So you said that he's a suspect in another case we didn't mention, Valerie, but he has been charged with Jessica's murder.
Yes. So the reason why I bring up Valerie is because Valerie and Jessica are very much connected, and they were found way before any of the victims along Ocean Parkway, way before the Gilgo Four, way before anyone else. So Valerie's remains were found in a place called Manorville, which is about 40 miles away from Ocean Parkway and Gilgo Beach. And Valerie, when she was found in November of 2000, her head was missing and her hands were missing, and she was completely dismembered and found in trash bags, and she's found in the woods. She was not able to be identified for 20 years. She was identified in 2000. But 3 years after Valerie's remains were found, Jessica Taylor's remains were found. Her head was missing, her hands were missing, and she was found within 1,000 feet of where Valerie was found 3 years prior. So everyone always believed that these two were connected. It wasn't until 2011, April of 2011, where when those other remains were found after the Gilgo Four, Valerie and Jessica's missing remains were found there.
Oh.
So that's how they were connected to the Long Island serial killer case, because their head and hands were found with the toddler and Peaches, the victim, and all these other victims that are connected to the case but had different MOs. The victims that caused the confusion about whether it was one or two killers. So Rex has been charged with Jessica Taylor's murder because, again, they found a hair that they were able to connect back to him. And this is very significant because while he hasn't been charged with those other victims along Ocean Parkway, her body parts were found amongst them, which leads everyone to believe that he will be charged with every other victim there.
Really?
Because this was obviously where, and all those other victims were left there earlier than the Gilgo Four. We're talking Karen Vergata's remains were found there. She was murdered in 1996. The Asian victim was murdered around 2006. Peaches was murdered in 1996. So this is like his earlier MO. He was dismembering and he was leaving them there. And then later on, he was leaving them whole, wrapped in burlap. So his MO evolved. And we know, he's been charged with Sandra Costilla. She was left somewhere else and murdered in a completely different way. So this guy really is like a chameleon as far as what he does to victims, what he's capable of doing, the locations where he's leaving them, and victimology. Some of these victims are white, some are Black, some are Asian. It's really shocking because we just don't know when it's going to end. We don't know how many he's responsible for because there's countless unsolved murders all across Long Island. And now we know that he doesn't just leave victims on Ocean Parkway because Sandra Costilla was found somewhere else. So it's really, he could be responsible for an untold number of victims.
Wow. So for the moment, he's been charged with 6 murders, if my count is correct, which he denies, I should point out. He is yet to stand trial. Where are we court-wise? Because we're still waiting for a trial. He was supposed to already have started one.
Before these additional charges were filed, the judge was trying to speed things along when he was only charged with the Gilgo Four. And they were trying to expedite the discovery, which means the prosecution handing over all the evidence to the defense so they could prepare. But now that victims keep getting added, it just gets less and less realistic that this trial is going to happen in a timely manner. And he's waived his right to a speedy trial. And it could be a lot longer because, as recently as last week, the DA held a press conference. They're still trying to identify some of these victims with the hopes of further connecting Rex Heurmann to them. And that's actively occurring. I mean, this is something they're working on day and night behind the scenes. So they may continue to charge him with victims, and that would just add more time between when a trial could occur because then his defense will have to prepare further.
Well, that could mean years, really.
It could mean years, yeah. I mean, we're already at 1 year having passed.
Is his wife supporting him in all of this?
So at first it seemed like no. She filed for divorce almost right away. it's hard to know exactly what the thinking is. She has been spotted at court appearances. She brought their dog to the last appearance. She has said things like, I want to see how it all plays out, innocent till proven guilty. I think there's a lot of psychological implications here with how hard it might be to come to terms with this reality. So I try to reserve judgment, but it appears that she's loosely supporting him. She's still visiting him in jail. We know that.
But we also know she signed a media deal.
Yes. So there is a documentary, a multi-part documentary. And yeah, she and her daughter, Victoria, are participating. I also sat for an interview for it. It's going to feature their perspective in terms of like their shock or, I'm interested to see what they've said. I have no idea. But I do know that this is going to be a long process. Them coming to terms with this reality is not going to be an overnight thing. And they've said that this was a financial decision. They have no money. She is in remission from cancer treatments. And the suspicion is that this was a financially motivated decision to participate in this documentary.
After the break, we learn what's happening now with Rex Heurmann's trial. The trial might be years away, but the prosecution has still been putting forward evidence as part of court proceedings, so we have been getting a few more details there about the allegations. Can you tell us about the kind of digital web and the ways that they accuse Heurmann of trying to contact victims?
Yes, so it's been reported that he has over 100 burner phones, which are they're called ghost phones sometimes. It's a phone you go into 7-Eleven and you buy minutes for that you can purchase anonymously and is not tied. Because like a regular cell phone is tied to a credit check, at least here in the US, is tied to, you need an ID for it. You need an address. It's directly tied to your identity. These phones, you can have as many as you want. You can add minutes to them. You cannot. So he was contacting victims that way. He was contacting victims through Craigslist using aliases and using alias emails, several of them. And he was doing this through these burner phones. So these emails weren't connected to his IP at his home or his office or connected to his personal computers. He was doing this all on these anonymous phones. We know that he was also using these phones for things like Tinder, years later. He continued doing this sort of dance with these electronics. He was also using digital shredding software, and that was an effort to erase, some of this digital evidence. A lot of the Google searches implicate him in really strange ways. He was Googling podcasts. He was Googling my podcast about the case. He was watching TV shows about the case. A lot of the evidence they have on him is this digital evidence, and it's very compelling when it's all laid out and put together.
They also talk about a supposed planning document or a blueprint, which is quite chilling.
Yeah, the planning document, I think, is sort of what ups the ante for people who are familiar with serial killer cases. I mean, I've never seen something so horrifying in my life. And basically, it's a Word document that was created in 2000 and updated several times between 2000 and 2003. And on this document, he basically talks about his pre-planning for the act itself, and what he does afterwards, cleanup notes. And it's essentially a to-do list of items he needs to buy, things he needs to do to ensure that he's going to get away with this, car maintenance, what to destroy, getting his story straight. He has notes on there about scouting dumping ground locations, scouting locations of picking the victims up, making sure there's no surveillance cameras, how to wash the victims' bodies, to check for fibers, to scrub for fingerprints, what kind of torture he wants to do. He also had notes about reading the book Mindhunter, which was written by John Douglas, the famed FBI profiler who essentially developed modern-day profiling in the FBI. He basically read John Douglas's book, Mindhunter, and took notes about how to confuse and mislead law enforcement so he could further get away with this. So it's really just a chilling glimpse into not only the monster we're dealing with, but also what these victims went through.
And also the level of evidence we have in this case. Do we know what his defence plans to use or do or to try and argue his case?
We don't know what they will ultimately do, but what Michael Brown, Rex Heurmann's defense attorney, has said during press conferences is that there were these other suspects that law enforcement had their eye on, to the point where it was rumored that an arrest was coming. And this was somebody who's not Rex Heurmann. This is someone else they had their eye on with the initials that matched these initials that were found on a piece of evidence, which is WM. So there was a belt found. It was found with Maureen Brainerd Barnes that had the words WM carved in the back of it. And for a long time, until they got the tip about the Chevy Avalanche, which led to Rex Heurmann, the assumption is that that's what the police were really focusing their search on, these initials. So we know that Michael Brown he's going to point to these other suspects as potentially being the real suspects, and they're going to try to poke holes in the hair evidence, because hair testing forever has been done with nuclear DNA and done with the root of the hair. This testing that was done with these hairs was done with mitochondrial DNA testing. So it's like very groundbreaking.
Am I right in saying that he plans to also bring in that police chief we mentioned earlier, James Burke?
So it's unclear as to whether he'll actually be called to testify, but Michael Brown, Rex Heurmann's attorney, has requested all of James Burke's files to review. So I'm sure he plans to point to negligence that was done in this case as a way to explain why potentially this evidence is not reliable, right? This was an investigation led by a corrupt criminal. How can we trust the validity of this evidence? Which I think is the biggest shame of what James Burke has done. Police work is supposed to be done with integrity so that convictions can be found with integrity, and it's really a shame that he's cast doubt on portions of this investigation.
You are so deep in this investigation, and it looks like it's going to keep unraveling. Does that feel, as a journalist, overwhelming for you, exciting? Are you kind of nervous as to what else might come out?
I'm excited because there are so many people who are still seeking answers and victims who are still seeking to have their identities back. I think there is more bad news to come. I think there is more to be learned about the depths of this person's depravity. But I think there's a lot of relief and justice to be found on this journey as well. People who don't know what happened to their family members, who will finally get those answers. People who have been wanting justice for 20 years, who are going to get it. So I think hopefully we're only on the upswing. And I just hope that we're able to connect more people to this serial offender, because we don't believe Sandra Costilla in 1993 was his first victim. We just don't. And we don't believe there were none between her and Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor. So who else is there? I think it's exciting that these investigators, these really good investigators now who care about this case, are going to connect all these dots and bring all this, hopefully, closure. I hate that word closure, but bring justice.
What about Long Island itself? It's used in the title, alleged Long Island serial killer. It's got such a spotlight on it. Has it tarnished the area? I mean, it's your former home. Will they ever be able to come out from underneath the weight of this?
It hasn't tarnished the area, but it's definitely shone a light on the area's shortcomings. Some of the systemic failures that have been occurring since the 1900s and earlier. There are a lot of marginalized people, a lot of oppressed people, a lot of attitudes about sex workers, people addicted to drugs. I think it's really brought an understanding to the people who have been in power and what they thought was important. This case was neglected largely because these women were in sex work. And I think that's the only reason they were able to get away with neglecting this case to this degree. So The area itself tarnished, no, but it really is like a microcosm for what is being talked about on a larger scale now.
Thanks to Alexis for assisting us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, and Tahli Blackman, with audio design by Stronach. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.